At 7:18 a.m., Mara Kincaid tapped her employee badge to enter the lobby, and the glass gate flashed a calm green circle like it approved of her existence. Then her phone buzzed. A notification from the company's wellness app. The one they swore was optional. The one they promised was private. Your risk trend has shifted. No explanation, no appeal. Just a new status that felt like a mark on skin. She stood under the lobby's bright, forgiving lights and watched her reflection in the marble hair, pinned neat, coat buttoned, face composed like a person with choices. But the message wasn't meant for her phone. It was meant for the system. Because when Mara Kincaid looked up, she saw it happen in real time. The wall-mounted screen that welcomed employees by name flickered, then skipped her. The screen displayed everyone else. Good morning, Owen. Good morning, Diana. Good morning, Marcus. And then it moved on, as if Mara Kincaid had never existed. The gate behind her clicked softly, sealing her inside the building. A second later, her badge went from green to yellow, and the security camera above the lobby, sleek as a black droplet, tilted a fraction downward. Not to watch the crowd, to watch her. At 7:19 a.m., Mara Kincaid realized the company wasn't tracking steps anymore. It was tracking futures. And hers had just been downgraded. She kept walking anyway because panic was what systems expected from people. And Mara Kincaid had spent her whole life learning how to look harmless while she was doing math in her head. The elevator doors opened. A voice inside the elevator purred, pleasant and genderless. Good morning. Please confirm your identity. Mara Kincaid stared at the camera hidden behind the mirror and felt something cold settle behind her ribs. This wasn't a glitch. This was a test. And the building had decided to ask her a question. The elevator had no buttons anymore. It had an interface smooth glass with soft icons, as if it were designed for a museum, not a workplace. A few employees stepped in behind her, laughing quietly, smelling like expensive coffee and good sleep. They didn't look at Mara Kincaid the way people look at a coworker. They looked the way people look at weather. Present. Unavoidable. Not worth discussing. The voice repeated, still gentle. Please confirm your identity. At 7:20 a.m., Mara Kincaid raised her chin and said, Mara Kincaid, compliance. The mirror camera blinked. Thank you, please look forward. She obeyed, because disobedience was a language the system could translate into punishment. A light scanned her face, warm, almost intimate, like a hand that didn't ask permission. The elevator paused for a half-second that felt like a held breath. Then it moved. But it didn't move to her floor. It moved to the 6th. That was facilities. That was where the building stored replacement chairs, spare monitors, and things that were quietly removed. The doors opened. 2 people stood outside, waiting, as if the elevator had summoned them. Security. Not uniformed, not dramatic, just clean suits, earpieces, neutral expressions, trained in the art of making cruelty look like policy. One of them smiled. Mara Kincaid? She didn't answer immediately. A compliance analyst learns early. The first person to speak is often the first person to lose control. At 7:22 a.m., she said, yes. The guard nodded, polite as a hotel concierge. Please come with us for a quick verification. The words were soft. The meaning wasn't. Quick verification meant a room with no windows and a conversation designed to be remembered incorrectly. Behind them, the hallway lights were too bright, too white, like the building was trying to bleach anything human out of the air. Mara Kincaid stepped out. The elevator doors closed behind her. And for the first time since she'd been hired, she noticed something she'd never noticed before. There was no down button on the panel outside the elevator. Only up. As if, once you were taken, the building didn't believe in return. They walked her past facilities, past a locked door with a small glass pane and a sign that read, Integrity Room. It almost made her laugh. Because integrity, she'd learned, was always the first word companies used when they were about to do something dishonest. At 7:25 a.m., she sat in a chair that was bolted to the floor. Across from her, a woman in a neat blazer placed a tablet on the table like it was evidence. Hi, Mara Kincaid, the woman said, smiling with practiced warmth. I'm Celeste from People Operations. People Ops, not HR. They'd renamed it, the way hunters rename traps. Celeste tapped the tablet. We're just noticing some anomalies around your wellness profile. There it was. That word again. Wellness. The company's favorite perfume used to cover the smell of control. Mara Kincaid kept her voice calm. What kind of anomalies? Celeste's smile didn't move. Nothing you need to worry about. We just need you to reconsent. Reconsent? Celeste tilted her head. Your wellness program participation. It might have drifted. Drifted. As if consent was a boat that could float away by accident. As if privacy was something you misplaced. At 7:27 a.m., Mara Kincaid realized the optional app was no longer optional. It was a leash. Celeste slid the tablet forward. On the screen, a consent form. Long, smooth, modern. Written in that corporate language that always sounded like it was helping you while it was taking something away. I agree to share biometric and behavioral data. I agree to allow aggregate analysis. I agree to third-party processing. Celeste said softly, we just want to ensure you're supported. Supported. A word that meant, give us access, or lose oxygen. The guard behind Mara Kincaid shifted his weight, just enough to remind her he was there. She looked at the signature line, and she didn't sign. Celeste's eyes narrowed by a fraction. Is there a reason you're hesitant? At 7:28 a.m., Mara Kincaid replied, I already consented. If you need a new consent, that means the terms changed. Celeste's smile held, but her voice cooled. Terms evolve. It's standard. Mara Kincaid nodded slowly, like she was considering it. But inside, her mind was moving fast. Because she'd seen the internal dashboards. Not officially. Not aloud. But compliance people see things by accident, the way firefighters see smoke. She'd seen a list once. It wasn't called a blacklist. It was called an optimization queue. A column of names. A column of numbers. A column labeled future cost risk. And now, she knew exactly what her notification meant. Your risk trend has shifted. It meant, you cost too much in the future. It meant, the company had decided to manage her like an expense. Celeste leaned forward. Mara Kincaid, she said gently, we want to keep you safe, but we can't do that if you won't participate. The sentence sounded like care. The structure sounded like a threat. At 7:30 a.m., Mara Kincaid asked, what happens if I don't reconsent? Celeste's eyes flicked to the guard, then back. We'll have to restrict your access while we review your eligibility. Eligibility? For what? To work? To enter a building? To exist on the welcome screen? Mara Kincaid stared at Celeste and felt something settle into place like a key finding its lock. They weren't just monitoring health, they were using the app to predict risk. Pregnancy risk, depression risk, injury risk, burnout risk. Anything that might make an employee human at the wrong time. And if the algorithm decided you might become inconvenient, the building would start forgetting you. Mara Kincaid looked down at the tablet again and let silence stretch. Silence was a tool. Silence made people fill space with truth. Celeste's smile tightened. Is there anything we can do to make you more comfortable? At 7:31 a.m., Mara Kincaid said, yes, I want a copy of the full data sharing policy and the list of third parties. Celeste blinked once. That was the moment. The moment the room's temperature changed. Because Celeste hadn't expected Mara Kincaid to know what to ask. Celeste laughed lightly, too lightly. Oh, those documents are available on the internet. My access is restricted, Mara Kincaid replied. Celeste's smile wavered. The guard behind her adjusted his stance again, and Mara Kincaid felt the shape of the trap. They were trying to push her into signing while she still had a job, or refuse and give them an excuse to remove her without resistance. Celeste slid the tablet closer. Just sign, and everything goes back to normal. Normal. A word that always arrives right before the door closes. At 7:33 a.m., Mara Kincaid picked up the stylus. Celeste's shoulders relaxed, almost imperceptibly. The guard's jaw unclenched. And then, Mara Kincaid did something that made the room go very still. She signed, but not on the consent line. She wrote 3 words in a blank margin. Small, neat, unmistakable. Under duress. Request counsel. Celeste froze. The guard stepped forward once. Celeste snatched the tablet back as if the words could infect the screen. Her voice stayed polite. Her eyes didn't. Mara Kincaid, that isn't necessary. Mara Kincaid kept her face calm. It's accurate. Celeste stood up slowly. At 7:35 a.m., she said, "We're going to pause this meeting. Please wait here." She walked out. The guard remained. And Mara Kincaid realized something else. The integrity room didn't exist to protect integrity. It existed to isolate the person who might expose it. She sat quietly, hands folded, breathing steady, because she knew the next move. They would try to scare her. They would try to label her. They would try to make her look unstable, non-compliant, difficult. And the wellness score would become the perfect weapon. Because an algorithm doesn't need to prove malice. It only needs to suggest risk. At 7:41 a.m., the door opened again. But it wasn't Celeste. It was a man Mara Kincaid had only seen once, from far away, in a leadership town hall where he spoke about trust like it was a product. His name was Graham Vale, Chief Operating Officer, a man with a calm smile and eyes like polished stone. He walked in like he owned the air. "Mara Kincaid," he said, as if greeting an old friend. "I hear we're having a misunderstanding." She didn't stand. Power likes it when you stand. She stayed seated. At 7:42 a.m., Mara Kincaid replied, "I hear my identity needs verification." Graham chuckled softly, like she'd made a joke. "Of course not. You're you. We know that." He sat across from her without asking. "We're a family here," he said. "And families need transparency." There it was. A velvet glove. And inside it, a fist. Graham leaned in slightly. "Sign the consent. Keep your access. Keep your role. Keep your trajectory." Trajectory. Like her life was a line on a chart he could adjust. Mara Kincaid met his eyes. "And if I don't?" Graham's smile didn't change. But his voice dropped lower, softer. At 7:43 a.m., he said, "Then the system will conclude you don't align with our culture." Culture. The corporate word for obedience. And then he added, gentle as a lullaby, "You don't want the system to misunderstand you, Mara Kincaid." That was the threat. Not from him. From the machine they'd built. He stood up, smoothing his suit. "Take a few minutes," he said. "Make the smart choice." He walked out. And the lock clicked behind him. At 7:44 a.m., Mara Kincaid finally allowed herself one small exhale. Because she understood the real stakes now. This wasn't about a signature. This was about whether she would let an algorithm own her. She looked at the security camera in the corner. Its tiny red light steady. Patient. And she did the one thing the company never anticipated. She smiled. Not because she was safe. Because she was certain. They had made one mistake. They had brought her into the integrity room, while her phone was still in her pocket. And Mara Kincaid had already set it to record. At 7:45 a.m., in complete silence, she opened a note and typed a single line to herself. "If they track my body, I will track their lies." Then, she sent one message to the only person in the building who still believed compliance meant something. A legal counsel she trusted. Subject line: "The wellness app is a weapon." And as she hit send, she watched her signal flicker like the building noticed. Like the building didn't like that she was speaking to the outside world. Her badge in her pocket buzzed again. One final notification. Access reduction. Pending. She didn't panic. She didn't cry. At 7:46 a.m., Mara Kincaid simply whispered, "Okay," because she wasn't going to win by begging the system. She was going to win by forcing it to testify. And if the building wanted to erase her, she would make it famous for trying. At 8:06 a.m., Mara Kincaid stepped out of the integrity room with her face still calm, because panic was the kind of honesty the office punished. The hallway looked the same. White walls, soft carpet, quiet lights, yet everything felt slightly off, like the building had shifted its weight to keep her under it. The security guard walked her back toward the elevator without touching her, because the best intimidation never leaves fingerprints. At 8:08 a.m., when Mara Kincaid stood in front of the elevator mirror again, the voice returned pleasant, patient, inhuman. "Destination? 21, she said, because that was her floor. The mirror blinked. "Access. Unavailable." The words didn't sound angry. They sounded final. A beat of silence passed. The guard didn't react. He'd already known. At 8:09 a.m., Mara Kincaid tried again. Softer, like politeness might convince a machine. 21. Access unavailable. And then, as if offering a consolation prize, the interface displayed. Available floors. Facilities. People ops. Training. The floors where careers went to be managed. The guard's voice finally entered the air. Looks like we'll need you on 7 for now. 7 was HR training rooms and culture workshops. 7 was where they taught you how to apologize for having boundaries. At 8:11 a.m., Mara Kincaid stepped into the elevator anyway and let it take her to a floor she didn't choose because she needed to see how far they were willing to go. The doors opened to a glass hallway lined with posters. Your best self is a compliant self. Wellness is performance. Data is care. All smiling faces. All clean fonts. It looked like propaganda, designed by someone who had never been sick. A receptionist looked up from behind a curved white desk. Her badge said, People Operations Support Specialist. She smiled too quickly, like she'd been warned. Hi, Mara Kincaid. They said you might be coming. At 8:12 a.m., Mara Kincaid asked. Who is they? The receptionist's smile twitched. Leadership. And people ops. And the system. She said the last part like it was a god you didn't insult. Then she slid a paper packet across the desk. Paper. In a building that had digitized everything. That was when Mara Kincaid knew this wasn't just a lockout. It was a containment protocol. The packet's cover page read, Temporary Access Adjustment. Employee Support Pathway. Underneath, in smaller letters, non-disclosure reminder included. Of course it was. At 8:13 a.m., Mara Kincaid flipped the packet open and found a checklist of steps written in that weaponized kindness. Attend a culture alignment meeting. Reaffirm wellness participation. Meet with leadership sponsor. Complete a reflection questionnaire. Restore access upon review. Reflection questionnaire. That meant, give them words they could later claim were admissions. The receptionist leaned forward like she was sharing something confidential. If you just do the steps, it'll clear fast. Most people get their access back within a week. A week. Enough time for your projects to be reassigned. Enough time for your reputation to rot. Enough time for the office to forget your name. At 8:14 a.m., Mara Kincaid closed the packet and said, Where's my manager? The receptionist's gaze dropped. Oh, your manager was reassigned. Reassigned. Like a chair. Like a password. Like a person. Mara Kincaid felt a thin heat run through her chest. Not rage. Not yet something sharper. They weren't just isolating her. They were removing the witnesses around her. At 8:15 a.m., Mara Kincaid asked, To whom? The receptionist hesitated, then whispered, They said interim oversight will come from operations. Operations. That meant Graham Vale. That meant the threat had turned into structure. A door opened behind the desk. Celeste stepped out. Crisp blazer, perfect hair, smile like a sealed envelope. Mara Kincaid, Celeste said, as if they'd last spoken at a holiday party instead of a locked room. Come on, we'll get you taken care of. Taken care of. The phrase made Mara Kincaid want to laugh again, but she didn't. She followed. They walked into a small conference room with one plant that looked plastic, and a screen on the wall that displayed a looping video of employees stretching and smiling. The chairs were spaced perfectly. Nothing in the room invited intimacy. Everything invited compliance. At 8:18 a.m., Celeste sat across from Mara Kincaid and folded her hands. First, I want to acknowledge your feelings. It was the first step of the script. We take psychological safety seriously. The second step, and we want to make sure you have the support you need. The third step, where the trap usually closed. Mara Kincaid kept her eyes steady. I need my access restored. Celeste's smile didn't break. That's part of the pathway. Celeste turned her tablet so Mara Kincaid could see the screen. There it was again. The consent form. But this time, the signature line had moved. The margins were gone. No place to write under duress. They'd patched the loophole. At 8:20 a.m., Celeste said, Sign, complete the pathway, and your access returns. Mara Kincaid asked, And if I don't? Celeste exhaled slowly, like she was the tired one. Then we need to consider whether this environment is healthy for you. Healthy for you. As if exile was medicine. Mara Kincaid leaned back slightly. Are you saying I'm unwell? Celeste's eyes flicked just once to the camera in the corner. Then back. I'm saying the system flagged a concern. The system. Always the system. A perfect villain because it never raised its voice. At 8:21 a.m., Mara Kincaid said, "Show me what it flagged." Celeste smiled harder. "That's not information we share. It's proprietary. Proprietary. Your body is proprietary. Your sleep is proprietary. Your future is proprietary." Mara Kincaid nodded slowly, as if accepting it. But she wasn't. She was collecting it. At 8:22 a.m., Mara Kincaid opened her phone under the table. Screen dimmed, recording still running. And she asked, "Does operations have access to this wellness flag?" Celeste replied too fast. "Leadership has limited visibility. Only for supportive purposes." That was the confession. Not a full one, but a clean corner of it. At 8:23 a.m., Mara Kincaid asked, "Does this affect promotions?" Celeste's smile thinned. "It helps us allocate resources responsibly." That was another confession. Promotion decisions disguised as resource allocation. Mara Kincaid asked, "Does it affect terminations?" Celeste's eyes sharpened. "We don't call it that." And there it was. The answer hidden inside the denial. Celeste tapped the tablet again, making the signature line glow as if it were holy. "Let's focus on what you can control, Mara Kincaid." Sign. Silence stretched. And in the silence, Mara Kincaid heard a door open in the hallway. Footsteps. Heavy. Unhurried. A presence arriving. At 8:25 a.m., Graham Vale walked in without knocking. Because power never knocks. He smiled at Celeste first, the way a man smiles at a tool that's working. Then he looked at Mara Kincaid like she was a malfunction. "Morning," he said. Mara Kincaid didn't greet him. Graham didn't sit. He stood behind Celeste's chair, hands resting on the back like he was claiming the room. He spoke softly, but every word had steel in it. "Mara Kincaid, you have a choice. You can be part of our ecosystem, or you can step outside it." Ecosystem. Like he was nature. Like she was invasive species. At 8:26 a.m., Mara Kincaid replied, "I'd like to see the policy that makes my biometric data part of your ecosystem." Graham's smile widened. "Ah, compliance." He said it like an insult. Then he leaned forward, lowering his voice so it felt personal. "You know what happens to people who make things difficult?" Mara Kincaid held his gaze. "They get documented," she said. Graham blinked. For the first time, something like surprise flashed across his face. Because Mara Kincaid wasn't begging. She was naming the mechanism. At 8:27 a.m., Graham chuckled. "You're smart. That's why you'll do the smart thing." He nodded at the tablet. "Sign." Mara Kincaid didn't move. Graham's tone stayed smooth, but the room tightened. "Let me be clear," he said, still gentle. "Your access is restricted. Your projects are frozen. Your name is being removed from systems as we speak." As we speak. That meant, while she sat here, her life was being edited. At 8:28 a.m., Mara Kincaid asked, "Who authorized that?" Graham smiled like a man who enjoyed games with only one player. "The system." Celeste watched Mara Kincaid carefully, like she was waiting for tears. The plant in the corner didn't move. The camera's red dot stayed steady. At 8:29 a.m., Mara Kincaid said, "Okay." It was the same word she'd used before. But this time, it wasn't surrender. It was permission for herself. She reached into her bag, slowly, so no one could accuse her of something dramatic. She pulled out a thin folder. Not paper from People Ops. Her paper, and she placed it on the table. Celeste frowned. Graham's smile faltered slightly. The folder contained printed screenshots. A list of internal dashboard fields Mara Kincaid had seen weeks ago. Not names. Not yet. But categories. Future cost risk. Maternal event probability. Mental health volatility. Injury likelihood. Graham's eyes went still. Celeste's mouth opened just a fraction. At 8:30 a.m., Mara Kincaid said softly, "If you're going to erase me, I need to understand the criteria." Graham's smile returned, but it wasn't warm anymore. It was sharp. "Where did you get that?" Mara Kincaid didn't answer, because answering would make it theft. Silence would make it a question. Graham leaned in. "You're out of scope." Out of scope. The phrase was almost funny. Because what he meant was, you saw behind the curtain. At 8:31 a.m., Graham said. Those fields don't mean what you think. Mara Kincaid replied. Then explain them. Graham didn't. He couldn't. Because explanations create records. And records create courtrooms. He straightened, then smiled again too carefully. Celeste, proceed with the pathway. Celeste nodded, grateful to retreat to procedure. She slid a new sheet across the table. A questionnaire. The first question read, have you experienced heightened emotional instability recently? That wasn't a question. That was a weapon disguised as concern. At 8:33 a.m., Mara Kincaid read the next one. Do you feel that others are targeting you at work? If you said yes, you sounded paranoid. If you said no, you surrendered your claim. A perfect trap. Mara Kincaid set the paper down. I'm not answering these. Celeste's smile became thin wire. Refusing to engage with support can be noted. Noted. Documented. Used. Graham's voice softened again, almost fatherly. Mara Kincaid. Don't do this the hard way. You're one person. We're a system. At 8:34 a.m., Mara Kincaid looked at him and said, systems collapse when they're forced to explain themselves. For the first time, Graham's expression flickered just a crack. Because he knew what she meant. He knew she had a recording. Maybe he didn't know how much. But he knew she had something. At 8:35 a.m., Mara Kincaid stood up, slowly, and pushed the questionnaire back toward Celeste, like it was contaminated. I'll be in contact through counsel, she said. Graham's smile returned polished, dangerous. You don't have counsel. Mara Kincaid replied, not yet. Then she walked toward the door. The guard outside stepped in front of it. Not touching her. Just blocking the air. At 8:36 a.m., Celeste said, you can't leave until we complete verification. Mara Kincaid tilted her head. Verification of what? My identity? Or my obedience? No one answered. And in that silence, Mara Kincaid felt the building's true nature. It wasn't a workplace. It was a closed circuit. People entered. Data stayed. And those who refused to become data didn't get to move freely. At 8:37 a.m., Mara Kincaid did something small, almost invisible. She raised her phone, still recording, and tapped one button. A live share link. Pre-sent to her trusted legal contact. If her phone lost signal, the upload would still complete the moment it found a breath of internet. Graham's eyes tracked the movement. His voice stayed calm, but something in it tightened. What did you just do? Mara Kincaid smiled faintly. Made sure the system has witnesses. Graham's smile disappeared completely. At 8:38 a.m., he said quietly. You're playing a dangerous game. Mara Kincaid replied. You built it. And then, her badge buzzed again. Not a message this time. A sound like a failing heartbeat. She looked down. The badge light had turned red. On the wall screen behind Celeste, the wellness video kept looping. Employees stretching, smiling, pretending. And beneath it, a new notification appeared, visible only to those in the room. Employee status. Under review, restrict movement. At 8:39 a.m., Mara Kincaid realized they'd escalated from quiet punishment to controlled detention. Not with handcuffs, with permissions, with doors, with elevators that only went up. And in that moment, she understood her next move wasn't about convincing them. It was about escaping with proof. Because if she stayed inside the system long enough, the system would rewrite her into someone who deserved what they did. She met Graham's eyes. And she said the sentence that made the room go cold. At 8:40 a.m., Mara Kincaid whispered, I want my personnel file. Celeste's face stiffened. Graham's jaw set. Because personnel files were where secrets lived. And secrets didn't survive daylight. At 8:41 a.m., the room didn't answer Mara Kincaid. That was how power stalled, by pretending it hadn't heard you. Graham Vale studied her like a chessboard that had just changed shape. Celeste sat perfectly still, hands folded, eyes trained on the table, as if looking up would make this real. The guard remained by the door, quiet as a locked thought. At 8:42 a.m., Graham spoke again. Slower now. Personnel files are confidential. Mara Kincaid replied, So am I. The camera's red light blinked once. Celeste cleared her throat. There's a process, she said carefully. Requests must be submitted through. My access is restricted, Mara Kincaid cut in. You told me that. So either I get the file now, or you're admitting this room isn't about support. The word support hung in the air like a bad smell. Graham smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. You're very determined, he said. That's admirable. It was the tone people used right before taking something from you. At 8:43 a.m., Mara Kincaid felt her phone vibrate, once soft, deliberate. A message. From outside. From the only place this building didn't control. Legal. Received. Do not consent. Continue recording. She didn't look down. She didn't smile. But something inside her settled. Graham nodded toward Celeste. Bring the file, he said, as if granting mercy. Celeste hesitated. Just a fraction too long. At 8:44 a.m., she stood and walked to the door, tapping her badge on the panel. The door unlocked, with a sound like a sigh. As she left, Graham leaned closer to Mara Kincaid, lowering his voice. You should understand something, he said quietly. The system doesn't make mistakes. Mara Kincaid met his gaze. Then people should stop hiding behind it. Graham's smile thinned. At 8:46 a.m., Celeste returned with a slim digital tablet. No paper, no ceremony. She placed it on the table between them. This is your personnel file, she said. Read only. Read only. Always read only. The tablet lit up. Name. Mara Kincaid. Role. Compliance analyst. Status. Under review. Then the sections unfolded. Performance reviews. Clean. Strong. No complaints. Attendance. Perfect. Peer feedback. Reliable. Sharp. Quiet. And then near the bottom, a section that didn't belong. Predictive wellness summary. Graham watched her eyes carefully now. At 8:47 a.m., Mara Kincaid scrolled. Risk trend. Elevated. Trigger factors. Sleep variance. Stress indicators. Cycle irregularity. Projected cost impact. Moderate. High. Recommendation. Monitor. Limit advancement. Prepare transition. Transition. That was the word they used when they didn't want to say removal. Mara Kincaid felt a pulse of heat in her throat, but she swallowed it down. Emotion was what the questionnaire wanted. At 8:48 a.m., she asked, Who authored this? Celeste replied, It's automated. Graham nodded. AI assisted. Best in class. Mara Kincaid didn't look up. Who approved it? Silence. Then Graham said, Leadership reviews trends, not individuals. That was a lie shaped like a technicality. At 8:49 a.m., Mara Kincaid tapped the screen. There's an access log. Celeste stiffened. Yes, for auditing. Show me. Celeste looked to Graham. He paused, just long enough for Mara Kincaid to notice. Then he nodded. Celeste swiped. The log appeared. Dates. Times. User IDs. Most were anonymized. But some weren't. Operations. People ops. And then, Veil viewed. 5 times. At 8:50 a.m., Mara Kincaid finally looked up. Graham didn't flinch. Executives need visibility, he said calmly. To protect the company. From me? Mara Kincaid asked. From risk. The word landed heavier than it should have. Because risk wasn't something she had done. It was something she might become. At 8:51 a.m., Mara Kincaid scrolled again. There was another name in the log. One she recognized. A former analyst. A woman who had vanished 6 months ago. No farewell email. No goodbye cake. Just gone. Her name was Elena Brooks. At 8:52 a.m., Mara Kincaid said it out loud. Elena Brooks. Celeste's breath caught. Just slightly. Graham's eyes sharpened. She left voluntarily, he said. But the speed of the answer betrayed him. Mara Kincaid tapped the screen. Elena Brooks had the same risk tag. She looked at Celeste. And the same recommendation. Prepare transition. At 8:53 a.m., Mara Kincaid asked, Where is she now? Silence again. The guard shifted. The plant didn't move. The camera kept watching. Graham folded his arms. She wasn't a culture fit. Culture. The graveyard word. At 8:54 a.m., Mara Kincaid leaned back. So this is how you do it, she said quietly. You don't fire people. You starve them of access. You isolate them. You document their stress. Then you call it data. Graham smiled without humor. You're simplifying. No, Mara Kincaid replied. I'm translating. Another vibration from her phone. She didn't check it. She already knew what it meant. Someone on the outside was listening now. At 8:55 a.m., Mara Kincaid said, I want a copy of the access logs. Celeste shook her head immediately. We can't. I want a copy, Mara Kincaid repeated, calm as glass. Or I'll subpoena them. The word hit the room like dropped metal. Graham laughed softly. You don't have standing. Not yet. Graham's eyes narrowed. At 8:56 a.m., Mara Kincaid added, but someone will. She tapped the screen one last time. And this proves discriminatory use of biometric data. Celeste's voice went thin. That's a serious accusation. So is predictive termination, Mara Kincaid said. The room felt smaller now. Not because the walls moved. Because the story had shifted. At 8:57 a.m., Graham straightened. I think this meeting is over. He nodded to the guard. The guard stepped forward. Not touching her. Just close enough to remind her of the building's weight. At 8:58 a.m., Mara Kincaid stood. I'm leaving, she said. Graham smiled. Your badge says otherwise. She reached into her bag, slowly, and pulled out something no one expected. An old-school USB drive. Small, ordinary, almost laughable. She held it up. I don't need your permission, Mara Kincaid said softly. I already have what I came for. Celeste's face drained of color. Graham's smile vanished. At 8:59 a.m., he said, that would be theft. Mara Kincaid met his eyes. So is what you're doing. She turned toward the door. The guard hesitated. Because this wasn't in his training. At 9 a.m., Mara Kincaid walked out. The hallway lights flickered just once. The posters still smiled. The elevator still waited. She tapped the button. For the first time that morning, the mirror spoke without resistance. Destination? She smiled faintly. Lobby. The doors closed. And as the elevator descended, Mara Kincaid whispered to herself, not in fear, but in focus. You wanted data. At 9:01 a.m., she added. Now you're going to explain it. At 9:12 a.m., Mara Kincaid stepped onto the sidewalk outside the tower and felt the city hit her like oxygen. Traffic. Wind. People who didn't need badges to exist. Behind her, the glass building reflected the sky, without apology already pretending nothing had happened. Her phone vibrated again. This time, it wasn't legal. It was an email. Subject line, all caps, cheerful and deadly. Announcement. A farewell and best wishes. At 9:13 a.m., Mara Kincaid stopped walking. She didn't open it yet. She already knew, because companies never wait for you to leave. They leave for you. She leaned against a steel railing, the cold grounding her, and opened the message. Dear team, we want to thank Mara Kincaid for her contributions. After thoughtful reflection, Mara has decided to pursue opportunities outside the company. We wish her wellness and success in her next chapter. Wellness. They never missed a chance to salt the wound. Below the paragraph were smiling headshots of leadership. Graham Vale's smile looked especially sincere. At 9:14 a.m., Mara Kincaid scrolled. There it was, a line that made everything else irreversible. Please direct any project-related questions to operations, effective immediately. Effective immediately. Her projects were gone. Her name was gone. Her story had already been rewritten. At 9:15 a.m., her phone buzzed again, text messages this time. Coworkers. Some careful. Some afraid. Some honest. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. HR says you chose to leave. Are you okay? I can't talk about this on company channels. That last one hurt the most, because it meant the system was working. Mara Kincaid closed her eyes for a moment, not to cry, but to catalog the feeling. This was the cost. Isolation by narrative. If they controlled the story, they didn't need to control her body anymore. At 9:17 a.m., she typed a reply to no one in particular and saved it as a draft. I did not resign. I was locked out. She didn't send it. Not yet. Because truth, without timing, is just noise. She walked. Each step took her farther from the building and deeper into the consequences. At 9:21 a.m., her bank app sent a notification. Direct deposit. Paused. There it was. The second cut. Not dramatic. Just enough to make panic tempting. Mara Kincaid breathed in, slow and controlled. Money fear was another lever the system loved. She wouldn't give them that either. At 9:24 a.m., her phone rang. A number she didn't recognize. She answered. Mara Kincaid, a calm male voice said. This is security operations. We noticed irregular data movement from your account. Irregular. They were already laying the trail. I'm no longer an employee, Mara Kincaid replied. A pause. Then, we're aware of the announcement. Of course they were. At 9:25 a.m., the voice continued, we're requesting you return any proprietary materials. Requesting. A word that sounded optional. Mara Kincaid said, have your counsel contact mine. Another pause. Longer. You don't have counsel listed. Mara Kincaid smiled faintly. You will. The call ended. No threats. No shouting. Just a record. She put the phone back in her pocket and kept walking. Because standing still was how fear caught up. At 9:31 a.m., she reached a small cafe, 2 blocks away. Brick walls, scratched tables. The kind of place where no one cared who you used to be. She ordered black coffee. Cash. Old habits suddenly felt wise. She sat near the window and finally allowed herself to open the USB drive. Just a glance, enough to reassure herself it was real. Logs, screenshots, timestamps. At 7:19 a.m. At 8:21 a.m. At 8:50 a.m. A map of decisions pretending to be data. Her phone vibrated again. This time, it was a different number. She answered. Mara Kincaid? A woman's voice asked. This is Lila Chen. Data infrastructure. Mara's spine straightened. Lila. She knew the name. Quiet. Brilliant. Always tired. At 9:33 a.m., Mara Kincaid said, I'm listening. There was a hesitation on the other end. I saw the farewell email, Lila said, and I recognized the pattern. Pattern. The word made everything click. At 9:34 a.m., Lila continued, Elena Brooks warned me something like this could happen. The cafe noise faded. You knew Elena? Mara Kincaid asked. Yes, Lila said. She trained me. Before she disappeared. Disappeared. Not left. Not resigned. Disappeared. At 9:35 a.m., Lila lowered her voice. There's something you should know. The wellness dashboard has a shadow layer. Mara didn't interrupt. You don't see it unless you're infrastructure, Lila said. But it logs downstream effects. Who gets removed from project lists? Who loses access? Who gets flagged for culture misalignment after a risk spike? Mara's grip tightened on the coffee cup. At 9:36 a.m., Mara Kincaid asked, Is it exportable? Lila exhaled. Yes. A single word. Heavy. Dangerous. At 9:37 a.m., Mara Kincaid said, Then we can prove intent. Another silence. Then Lila whispered, That's why I called. Outside, the city kept moving, unaware that a quiet war had just gained a second soldier. At 9:38 a.m., Mara Kincaid felt something new beneath the fear. Relief. She wasn't alone anymore. Not really, Lila continued. Elena left something. A timed email. It goes out if certain internal conditions are met. Mara's heart slowed, focused. A dead man's switch, she said. Yes, Lila replied. It hasn't triggered yet. But your lockout moved the system closer. At 9:39 a.m., Mara Kincaid looked at her reflection in the cafe window. She looked tired. But she also looked awake. Then we don't rush, she said. We document. Lila hesitated. They'll come after you. I know, Mara Kincaid said calmly. They already have. Another vibration. Another email. This one, from an external address. Board inquiry. Request for information. She didn't open it yet. She smiled. At 9:40 a.m., Mara Kincaid said into the phone, Send me the shadow logs. Secure channel only. Lila agreed. The line went dead. The coffee cooled. The city breathed. And Mara Kincaid understood the shape of the next phase. The company had tried to erase her quietly. So she would force them to explain themselves loudly. Not with revenge, with records. With timelines. With witnesses. She opened her draft message again. I did not resign. I was locked out. At 9:41 a.m., she added one more line. And I can prove it. She saved it. Not sent. Not yet. Because the most dangerous thing to a system like this was a story that refused to disappear. At 9:48 a.m., Mara Kincaid sat alone at the cafe table, laptop closed, phone face down, because paranoia wasn't fear anymore, it was procedure. The shadow layer couldn't be opened in public Wi-Fi. Lila had been clear about that. So Mara waited. She watched the door. She watched reflections in the glass. And she counted breaths until her phone vibrated twice. Short, deliberate. A code they'd agreed on. At 9:52 a.m., Mara Kincaid stepped outside, crossed the street, and entered a co-working space that still believed in keys instead of badges. She paid for 1 hour. Cash. Old habits again. Inside a quiet room, she finally flipped her phone over. A secure link. No subject line. Just a timer counting down from 1959. At 9:54 a.m., Mara Kincaid whispered, "Okay." She tapped. The first file loaded slowly, like it was nervous to exist. Shadow, effects, log read only. Columns appeared. Not emotions. Not opinions. Consequences. Wellness risk spike. Access reduction. Timestamp. Project removal. Performance. Narrative shift. Exit classification. Mara Kincaid scrolled. And there it was. A clean, merciless pattern. At 7 to 19 a.m., her risk score spiked. At 8:06 a.m., her elevator access was denied. At 8:14 a.m., her manager was reassigned. At 9:12 a.m., the farewell email was drafted. At 9:13 a.m., it was sent. New human names. Just inevitability. At 9:56 a.m., Mara Kincaid opened the second file. Executive View Visibility Trace. This one hurt more, because it proved intent. User IDs. Timestamps. Manual overrides. There were fingerprints here. At 8:50 a.m., an executive override aligned her risk profile with transition preparation. Not automated. Chosen. At 9:57 a.m., Mara Kincaid leaned back and closed her eyes for one full breath. This wasn't suspicion anymore. This was choreography. Her phone buzzed. A message from Lila. Lila. You seeing it? Mara. Yes. A pause. Then, Elila. Elena called it clean violence. No bruises, no screams, just doors that stop opening. At 9:58 a.m., Mara Kincaid typed, Mara, we need a timeline that a board can't ignore. 3 dots appeared. Then stopped. Then appeared again. Lila. There's more. The shadow layer predicts outcomes. It doesn't just record them. Mara's jaw tightened. Mara. Explain. At 9:59 a.m., Lila sent another file. Outcome model confidence. Waiting. A sentence glowed at the top. Sterile and damning. Reputational friction increases voluntary exit probability. Voluntary. They had named the lie. At 10 a.m., Mara Kincaid felt something steady take over her chest. Not anger, not fear. Clarity. She replied, Mara. Board meeting schedule? A longer pause this time. Then, Lila. Emergency session. 3:30 p.m. Closed agenda. Closed. That meant they were already trying to contain the blast radius. At 10:01 a.m., Mara Kincaid stood and packed her bag. Okay, she whispered again. But this time, it wasn't acceptance. It was alignment. At 10:07 a.m., Mara Kincaid called her legal contact back. She didn't need reassurance. She needed precision. At 10:08 a.m., she said, I have logs showing predictive use of biometric data tied to access removal and narrative manipulation. A pause. Then the voice on the other end changed tone. That's discovery grade, the lawyer said. How exposed are you? At 9:13 a.m., Mara Kincaid replied. They announced I resigned. Another pause. Longer. Then they're afraid, the lawyer said. What do you want? Mara Kincaid looked at the files again. I want them to explain it themselves. Silence. That's dangerous, the lawyer said. I know, Mara Kincaid replied. That's why it works. At 10:12 a.m., she hung up and opened her draft message again. Not the one to coworkers. A new one, addressed to the board's generic inbox. Subject line: Request for correction. Material misstatement. She didn't send it yet. She attached 3 files instead. The shadow layer summary. The access logs. The executive visibility trace. At 10:14 a.m., she saved the draft. Because timing was everything. At 10:21 a.m., another secure link arrived. This one, from an unfamiliar address. No timer. Just a single audio file. Elena. B. If you're hearing this, Mara Kincaid pressed play. A woman's voice filled the room, steady, tired, unmistakably human. If you're hearing this, Elena said, it means they decided I was expensive. The room seemed to lean closer. They won't fire you, Elena continued. They'll surround you with concern until you disappear. At 10:23 a.m., Mara Kincaid felt her throat tighten. Elena kept speaking. I built the dead man switch because I needed leverage. If my risk profile crossed a threshold and my access dropped below baseline, the files would queue for release. A breath. They never expected someone else to notice. At 10:25 a.m., Elena's voice softened. If you're the one listening now, don't rush. Let them lie. Then make them repeat the lie on record. The audio ended. Mara Kincaid sat very still, because Elena had just given her the strategy. Let them speak. At 10:27 a.m., Mara Kincaid typed to Lila, Mara, can the shadow layer be mirrored externally? A pause. Then, Lila, yes. Brief window. After 3:30 p.m., access collapses. At 10:28 a.m., Mara Kincaid replied, Mara. Then we wait. At 11:02 a.m., Mara Kincaid finally sent the message to her former team. Short, controlled, public. I did not resign. I was locked out following a wellness risk flag. I've asked the board to correct the record. No accusations, just facts. Within minutes, reactions bloomed and vanished. Messages typed, then unsent. Fear moves faster than truth. At 11:11 a.m., her phone rang again. Security operations. She let it go to voicemail. The voicemail arrived seconds later. Please return company property by end of day. End of day. A deadline without authority. At 11:18 a.m., Mara Kincaid forwarded the voicemail to her lawyer. Then she waited. Because now the trap was set. At 1:06 p.m., the board inbox replied. A single sentence. We are reviewing. At 2:14 p.m., another email leaked internally, this one quieter. Please refrain from speculation regarding recent personnel changes. Speculation. They were trying to dam a river with language. At 3:02 p.m., Mara Kincaid opened the secure channel with Lila. Mara. Ready? Lila. As I'll ever be. At 3:14 p.m., the shadow layer began to mirror file by file, timestamp by timestamp, into an external vault beyond the building's reach. At 3:22 p.m., Mara Kincaid received one final internal notification. Access. Terminated. She smiled. Because access didn't matter anymore. At 3:29 p.m., 1 minute before the board met, Mara Kincaid hit send on the draft she'd prepared hours ago. Subject line unchanged. Attachments intact. And in the body, one sentence only. Please explain how wellness data was used to predict and engineer voluntary exits. At 3:30 p.m., somewhere far above her, a meeting began. And for the first time, the system had to speak without hiding behind the word care. At 3:30 p.m., Mara Kincaid wasn't in the room where the board meeting began, but she could feel it anyway, like pressure changing before a storm. Somewhere above the city, behind glass that didn't open, 12 people took their seats and believed they were still in control of the narrative. They were wrong. At 3:31 p.m., the chair of the board cleared her throat and said, Let's proceed. Closed session. The doors shut. Inside the room, Graham Vale sat with his hands folded, calm on the surface, rehearsing the version of events he'd already told himself. Outside the room, Mara Kincaid watched the minutes pass on her phone. Not pacing, not praying, just waiting. Because this part didn't belong to her anymore. It belonged to the record. At 3:34 p.m., the first question landed. Not from legal. Not from HR. From a board member who hadn't spoken much in years. Why did an employee announce a lockout within hours of a wellness flag? Silence followed. The kind that makes people glance at each other instead of answering. At 3:35 p.m., Graham leaned forward. There was no lockout, he said smoothly. Just a temporary access review. Temporary. A word that could stretch forever if no one challenged it. At 3:36 p.m., another voice joined in. Then why was a farewell email drafted before the review concluded? This time, Graham hesitated. Just a fraction too long. At 3:37 p.m., he said, communications prepared a contingency. A lie polished to sound like foresight. At 3:38 p.m., a third board member spoke. Prepared based on what? And now the room shifted. Because that question didn't ask for reassurance. It asked for causation. At 3:39 p.m., Graham smiled again, but his voice lost some of its ease. Based on risk indicators. Standard procedure. Risk. The word echoed. At 3:40 p.m., someone else said, define risk indicators. Graham glanced at legal. Legal didn't move. Because? Legal had read the attachments. At 3:41 p.m., Graham adjusted his tie. Wellness data. Aggregate trends. Nothing personally identifiable. That was the sentence. The one Elena had warned about. The one that would now live forever. At 3:42 p.m., the chair spoke again. Then why does the executive visibility trace show your user ID accessing an individual predictive summary 5 times? The air went thin. Graham didn't answer immediately. Because there was no language left that could turn that into an accident. At 3:43 p.m., Mara Kincaid felt her phone vibrate once. A message from Lila. They're looking at the logs. Mara closed her eyes, not in relief, but in focus. This was the moment where power either doubled down or slipped. At 3:44 p.m., Graham finally spoke. Executives require visibility to manage organizational health. A board member replied. Health of whom? Another pause. At 3:45 p.m., Graham said, of the company. And that was the mistake. Because at 3:46 p.m., a quiet voice on the far end of the table said, then explain why maternal event probability appears in the model. No one moved. Not even Graham. Because that phrase wasn't supposed to leave the system. At 3:47 p.m., he tried. That field is theoretical. It's never operationalized. At 3:48 p.m., legal finally spoke. According to the shadow effects log, it was. The room stopped breathing. At 3:49 p.m., someone whispered, shadow effects? And now the system had been named. At 3:50 p.m., the chair turned to legal. Did we authorize this layer? Legal didn't look at Graham. No, she said. We were not informed. In another place, at 3:51 p.m., Mara Kincaid opened the audio file, again Elena's voice, and let it play softly through her headphones. Not for information, but for steadiness. At 3:52 p.m., inside the boardroom, Graham spoke too quickly. The shadow layer is an optimization artifact. It doesn't make decisions. At 3:53 p.m., the same quiet board member said, then why does it predict exit probability? Graham opened his mouth, closed it. Then said the sentence that ended him. At 3:54 p.m., he said, we needed to anticipate outcomes to protect margins. Margins. Not people. Margins. At 3:55 p.m., the chair leaned back. Are you saying employees were managed toward voluntary exit based on biometric forecasts? Graham realized too late that there was no safe answer. Yes, he said, but responsibly. At 3:56 p.m., the meeting crossed a line it couldn't uncross. Because now, it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an admission. At 3:57 p.m., Mara Kincaid received another message. Lila, dead man switch armed. At 3:58 p.m., the chair said, we need to pause. But systems like this never stop when asked politely. At 3:59 p.m., a board member asked the last question Graham Vail would answer as COO. Was this disclosed to employees? Graham didn't speak. He didn't need to. At 4 p.m., the dead man switch triggered. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just efficiently. Emails queued months ago began to land in regulators' inboxes in journalists' secure folders, in compliance hotlines that couldn't pretend not to see them, logs, timelines, explanations written by the system itself. At 4:01 p.m., Mara Kincaid felt her phone buzz again and again, notifications stacking like proof. She didn't look at them yet. She knew what they said. At 4:02 p.m., inside the boardroom, someone stood. "This meeting is no longer closed," the chair said. "And neither is this matter." At 4:03 p.m., Graham Vale finally looked small. Not punished. Not arrested. Just exposed. Which was worse. At 4:04 p.m., Mara Kincaid stepped out of the co-working space and into the late afternoon light. The city didn't applaud. It didn't need to. At 4:05 p.m., her phone rang. A number she recognized now. Board counsel. "Mara Kincaid," the voice said, careful and respectful. "We need to correct the record." She stopped walking. Cars passed. People laughed. Life continued. At 4:06 p.m., Mara Kincaid replied, "Start with the truth." A pause. Then, "We will." At 4:07 p.m., she ended the call. Not victorious. Just finished. Because revenge would have been loud. What she'd done was quieter. She hadn't destroyed the system. She'd forced it to explain itself. And systems like that never survive their own explanations. At 4:08 p.m., Mara Kincaid walked on. No badge, no access, no company name attached to her anymore. Only a record. And for the first time since 7:18 a.m. that morning, the future didn't feel like something being calculated about her. It felt like something she owned again. At 6:42 p.m., Mara Kincaid stood in her apartment kitchen, shoes still on, lights off, listening to the city exist without asking her permission. Her phone rested on the counter, face down. It hadn't stopped vibrating for an hour. Messages, emails, missed calls, all arriving too late. At 6:44 p.m., she finally turned the screen over. The first email was short. Subject: Board resolution. Immediate actions. She opened it. Effective immediately, Graham Vale has been placed on administrative leave, pending independent investigation. Administrative leave. The company's favorite phrase for, "We can't protect you anymore." At 6:45 p.m., Mara Kincaid scrolled. An external audit has been commissioned regarding the use of biometric and wellness data. Commissioned, not announced. They were still trying to sound calm. At 6:46 p.m., she read the last line. "We acknowledge that prior communications regarding Miss Kincaid's departure were inaccurate." Inaccurate. They still couldn't say the word false. But it was enough. At 6:47 p.m., Mara Kincaid set the phone down again and exhaled. Not relief. Release. Because the fight was over. And now came the cost. At 6:52 p.m., another message arrived, this one forwarded from a former colleague. An internal memo. Unbranded. Unsigned. Just text. Pending review. All predictive wellness models are suspended. Suspended, not deleted. Systems rarely destroy themselves. They wait. At 6:54 p.m., Mara Kincaid poured herself a glass of water and stared at the reflection in the dark window. She looked older than she had that morning. Not weaker. Sharper. At 7:01 p.m., her phone rang again. A number she didn't recognize. She answered. "Mara Kincaid," a man's voice said, measured, careful. "This is board counsel." She stayed silent. "We'd like to discuss next steps," he continued. Reinstatement. Compensation. A public clarification. Reinstatement. The word landed flat. At 7:02 p.m., Mara Kincaid replied, "I'm not coming back." A pause. "Longer than usual." "I see," the voice said. "May I ask why?" She looked around her small kitchen. The chipped mug. The quiet. The absence of cameras. At 7:03 p.m., Mara Kincaid said, "Because I don't want my worth calculated again." Another pause. Then, softer. "Understood." At 7:05 p.m., the call ended. No threats. No persuasion. Just the sound of a door closing from the other side. At 7:11 p.m., Mara Kincaid opened one final message. From Lila. "It's over." Shadow layer offline. "They're scrubbing everything." Mara typed back. "Good, the record won't scrub." 3 dots appeared. Then disappeared. At 7:14 p.m., Another name appeared on her screen. Elena Brooks. Not a ghost this time. A real address. A real message. If you're reading this, you did what I couldn't. Mara closed her eyes. Elena continued. I left the company with nothing but notes and fear. You left with proof. At 7:16 p.m., Mara Kincaid felt something break, not painfully, but cleanly, like a bone set back into place. She typed one line back. You were not invisible. The reply came almost immediately. Neither was signed. Neither needed to be. At 7:22 p.m., Mara Kincaid sat on the floor, back against the couch, phone resting in her lap. She thought about the people still inside the building. The ones who would sleep better. The ones who wouldn't. At 7:28 p.m., a news alert flashed across her screen. Not a headline. Just a sentence. Company announces internal review following data governance concerns. No names. No drama. That was how accountability entered quietly. At 7:31 p.m., Mara Kincaid turned the phone off. Because she didn't need to watch it spread. She'd already done the work. At 7:38 p.m., she opened her laptop not to check email, not to look for jobs. She opened a blank document. The cursor blinked. Waiting. At 7:39 p.m., Mara Kincaid typed a title. On Systems That Confuse Care with Control. She didn't know where it would go yet, only that it needed to exist. At 7:41 p.m., she paused, then added a line beneath it. Written by someone who survived the math. She leaned back. Outside, the city hummed. Inside, the silence felt earned. At 7:45 p.m., Mara Kincaid understood something simple and final. They hadn't lost power because she fought harder. They lost it because she refused to disappear quietly. And that was the cost they could never recover. At 7:47 p.m., she turned off the light and let the room go dark. Not erased. Just at rest. Because tomorrow wouldn't be calculated. It would be chosen.